I'm sorry. Okay. Good evening. I'm sorry, we're still working out technical difficulties, but we're getting there. And this is the interview that should have been held before, and now we are finally here. And I'm going to make this briefer than it was so we can get started. My name is Marjorie Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room Boston. The Writers' Room is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers. It's quiet. It's a wonderful place to just come and work in silence with other writers. The Writers' Room has been around since 1993. And when the pandemic came and it became hard for people to come, really impossible for people to come, we started doing more things online. So we have a reading series once a month with authors who read. And we started this interview series, which we hope to talk with authors, but also with publishers and agents and get some guidance for online publishing. So if you're curious about the room or you have any questions, please check out the Facebook page, Instagram page, and our website, which has photos and announcements. So this is an early offering in the interview series, and tonight we will be talking to Jennifer Lang. Jennifer was born in the San Francisco Bay Area and now lives in Tel Aviv, where she runs IsraelWritersStudio.com. Her prize-winning essays appear in Baltimore Review, Under the Sun, Midway Journal, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts and is an assistant editor at Brevity Journal, as well as being a longtime yoga practitioner and instructor. Her most recent book, Places We Left Behind, chronicles her marriage and the years she and her husband spent together negotiating the meaning of home and family as they moved between Israel, Europe, and America with their children. She also has a number of shorter pieces that explore similar territory, and all her work rests in the context of how family and home change and evolve in the midst of wider world events. As she explores these themes, Jennifer uses different genres and text to capture what she wants to say. And given all that has happened in the past week in Israel and the shock waves around the world, and given that this memoir is in part certainly about living in Israel, being in Israel, and what's that like, I'm going to sort of just right now just give the microphone over to Jennifer and have her read a section of her book and also talk about how she now links the book with what's been happening. So Jennifer, you go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Marjorie and Writers' Room of Boston for hosting me tonight. So this is my book, Places We Left Behind, a memoir in miniature. And I started my book tour. My book came out September 5th. I started events in California the week of September 20th. And as of October 7th, everything has changed. And I'm now here not to have conversations so much around marriage and compromise, identity and voice, but around what it's like to live in this region that I call home. So I wanted to start by reading. I have very, very short chapters and experimental prose, and I'm going to start in 1990, pardon. Stuck. Weeks before our nuptials, 1,019 miles east, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and threatens to attack Israel, and I want to scream. At the nonstop news headlines, the irrational Iraqi president, my foolhardy decision to abandon my plans and stay in this unstable region. But sound sticks to the sides of my throat like dried glue. Distort. As November rolls into December, rolls into January, all anyone ever talks about is Iraq this, Kuwait that, and war. After Hussein attempts to transform what he initiated as an Arab-Arab conflict into an Arab-Israeli conflict. But Israel fails to engage and declares a state of emergency and puts the army on high alert, delivering a karate chop blow to our honeymoon phase and driving my low blood pressure to a boil when, at 3 a.m. on January 18th, 1991, We hear a haunting sound, dash down hall, grab cordless phone in kitchen, enter guest room, turn on light, slam door, seal with duct tape, snatch cardboard boxes from closet, rip open, remove protective guards, don gas mask, gag. Hear husband say breathe, try not to gag. Hear rockets outside windows covered with industrial strength plastic sheeting, gag. Hear CNN report live in the Middle East, try not to gag. Hear phone ring, gag. Hear parents ask if we're okay as they watch CNN report live in California, try not to gag. Hear my muffled voice beneath hefty rubber mask say we're okay, gag. I'm okay, try not to gag. Hand in hand, we carry our gas masks everywhere, to work, to friends, to cafes. Shrill sirens ring at random times. Each one unnerves me, making me feel tiny and vulnerable, making me curse myself, question my decisions. One night at the movies, we recline in frayed burgundy seats, hand in hand, laughing at small-time con man John Cusack in The Grifters. After intermission, only in Israel, and before the end, just our luck. The lights go on, actors fading out as if a director yelled, cut, when we hear it. The unmistakable, high-low, up-down, ear-shrieking sound. Ready? Philippe asks. I'm not, but have no choice. I married this place as much as I married this person. We retrieved the chunky boxes underneath our chairs. We've been through this drill enough that we no longer need help fastening the masks, enough that I no longer gag, enough that I fear hearing it again. For 6 weeks, Scud missiles fall, mainly hitting the greater Tel Aviv and Haifa regions. No one around us is hurt. On the surface, we're untouched. But inside, in my kishkis, everything throbs. And the last one. Coming, sorry.
Right.
Okay, I lost my bookmark. Witness. 9 weeks after arriving in New York, one postcard pretty September morning, Philippe calls from work, his tone frantic and unfamiliar, telling me to turn on the TV faster than fast. So I race upstairs to my office, where, on my grandmother's hand-me-down black and white Sony set, I bear witness to the twin towers blazing and smoke billowing and bodies leaping, when a faraway voice says, see, terrorism is everywhere. Even New York isn't safe.
Thank you for that. What we talked about, and you can talk about it more sort of today or in the broader context, was how writing a memoir, really how anybody writing a memoir is writing an historical period of time. And maybe you can talk a little about, how that affected you when you were writing the memoir. And would you do anything different today, or would you write a different memoir today?
No, I think I'd probably write the same story. It had to be written. But because of where I live, that historical context is unavoidable. It
Mhm.
it dictates our life. It is in the background of our daily life. It is the thing that for me, it's the like my core emotion is affected by that reality. And so for many, many years, I just felt fear and couldn't reconcile with that fear. And
Mhm.
I wanted that fear in the book, in the pages, to be loud and clear. I have a very stoic, stone-like, stable husband, thank God, because I'm like the roller coaster of emotions.
Mhm.
And he's always downplayed that fear. And I think for me, the fact that this book is coming out now, it's out 5 weeks ago, and this happened,
Mhm.
it's all of my fears and then some come true. It is absolutely insane for me that this is what's going on with these words out in the world, with
Mhm.
my words out in the world. Somebody used the word prophetic in talking
Mhm.
to me about my book, and it was like, I got the chills.
Mhm. And given what you're describing, and so tell people watching and listening a little bit too about, let's go back to the theme of home, because part of it is that you don't just live in Israel, but that you've lived in different places and tried to make homes and understand what home means. So, and all of those places are so different from one another.
Mhm.
Can you say a little more about that?
Sure, sure. So, yeah, home means different things to different people. And I think that for me, I have another book coming out in a year from now, October 15th, 2024. It's called Landed, a Yogi's Memoir in Pieces and Poses. So this story, Places We Left Behind, is 1989 to 2011,
Mm-hmm.
from the time we met in Israel to the time, and then we left, and we did many, many moves in search of home. And then in 2011, we returned to Israel. And we've now been there 12 years. Landed, the second book, starts in that landing in 2011. And it's while the first book is all about home, it isn't actually, when I look back at it, it isn't actually the answer to home. I didn't find home yet. I was
Mm-hmm.
just willing to open myself up to it in the move back. So the second book is my journey on and off a yoga mat during 7 years, when I really, really finally crack it open. And what I find inside is really surprising. Not for you, maybe, but for me, which is home is less about a geographic address and more about who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many people understand that. And
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, I had to be 52 years old to finally get the memo.
Well, I'm still getting a lot of memos at much older age than that. And because you have this sort of rich life, home wise, geographically, and you and I talked a little bit about this off camera, but I was saying that I would never write a memoir. I can't imagine writing a memoir. What prompted you to write the memoir in the first place? And then I'm going to come back to how you chose to write it.
Mm-hmm. So I was in graduate school. I did an MFA at Vermont College of Fine Arts, 2014, 15, 16. And my first summer, I went home early July, around July 4th, July 5th of 2014. And I landed in Israel, and a 50-day military operation started. And so that whole 50 days of summer, I was running for shelter, hearing sirens, and paralyzed, couldn't write, could not function. Had a son in the army, could not function.
Mm-hmm.
And I emailed my mentor to say, I've got a problem. I'm really, like, I might not get my packets to you every month. And then once I was able to get beyond that paralysis, it just started to come out. And so one of the first stories that I wrote was about being in the sealed room of 1991, as a young 25-year-old newlywed, and gas masks,
Mm-hmm.
and being in the sealed room, or the shelter, with my husband and now two of my three kids, one in the army and my two teenage daughters. And I was going back past tense, present tense, past tense, present tense with the two situations. And my marriage was a large focal point of that. And my mentor said to me in the margins, I think you might want to separate your marriage from the sealed room. I think your marriage deserves its own space.
Hmm.
And I spent the next months, 4 months, 5 months, back in the margins saying, what about my marriage? What's so interesting about my marriage to write about? Because when you're in something, you don't see what's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he pointed things out. And so at that point, I had to turn to my husband to say, hey, is that okay if, get permission? And I started to write. I started to write, like, first in scenes, just going back in time, trying to remember everything. And then I went to old journals, and then I went to our photo albums, and then I went to old letters that my mom, my aunt, and a really old friend had returned to me about me writing to them in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a gift. And cracked it open. And so that's where the idea came to write with the focal point of the marriage.
And so when you say you cracked it open, what was the it that you cracked open, you think?
Um, I, we were moving and raising a family, and moving and raising a family, and we had our own little marital power struggle, not little, major power struggle, tug of war over two main things: where to live and how much Judaism to live by. And I guess, is like those two issues wrapped into one, the hot buttons in our marriage. And for me, that's what I cracked open in this book. And instead of focusing on it in a negative way, I turned it into a love story, I think.
And so when your mentor said, you need to separate these two things, what was it that needed to be separated? Is there, is there then a whole piece that you left out that you'll come back to? Is that?
So I then went on to publish 2 different essays about the sealed room.
Got it. Okay.
Less about the marriage and more about, that experience.
Yeah.
I think, I guess I look at it like that. This became more about the marriage, and those standalone essays were more about the sealed room.
Okay. And so when you wrote the memoir, and you do this in your other work as well, you mix different genres when you write. It's not just a straightforward, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. How did you come to that, decide to do it, pick the genres?
So, so first of all, I don't even think of it as mixed genre. I think of it as experimental prose. And I think it's not necessarily the same thing. Someone has said that I something about poetry, and it's like, oh, wow, I know nothing about poetry. I am not a poet. I set some of my pieces up to look like poems, but I'm not a poet. I have a strong visual component in the book. I'm not an artist. I did what I could with, YouTube teaching me how to do it in Word. So, but how did I come to it? In kind of the 9th hour, it was traditional prose all the way up until 9 months before signing a contract, or 3 months up until really submitting it to Vine Leaves Press, where the publisher. And I was hunting around in chapbook, prose, nonfiction competitions, because initially this was such a short manuscript that it was considered chapbook length. And in those guidelines, those submission guidelines for contests and non-contests, was this word experimental prose. I was like, wow, what is that? I loved that. Didn't know what it meant, loved it. And I remembered that a friend, an early reader, years ago, in the very long-winded 90,000 and then later the 65,000 word manuscript, had said to me, I wish I could see the pro-con list when you were debating about moving in with your boyfriend. And I just let it go because I didn't have the pro-con list. And then I realized that I could recreate the pro-con list. So I took the page and I made 2 columns, and I put a plus minus, and I put a minus sign, and I put the line down the middle, and I put the line across, and I just started to recreate my list. And again, those old letters helped me. And then I realized that also in one of the earlier chapters that I was taking my husband, from one gate in the old city of Jerusalem to the Wailing Wall, and we were zigzagging through the alleys of the old city. And so I set the text up on the page. I think poets do this all the time. But again, I don't know anything about poetry. I should really educate myself, because I think I sound stupid when I say this. But I started to zigzag across the page to show, to mirror what we were doing in the old city. And then it went from there. Those were the easy ones. It went from there. I did what I did to avoid repetition. I don't like, as a reader, when an author repeats information and thinks the reader is dumb and doesn't retain the information. I can read a really good story and lose total interest when information is just hitting me over the head. So I have a chapter called Conjunctions, if I can find it. Coordinates, pardon me. Coordinates. Where I take the coordinates of California or New York and the coordinates of Israel, and you don't need to understand where those coordinates are, but I did not want to repeat again and again and again what the struggle was. So it was me trying to say it differently.
And it sounds like sort of really letting the text give you ideas Again,
Mhm.
some of it quite visual.
Yeah.
That if I want this text to sort of speak to an audience and not just be repeating the facts, the same thing over and over again, one way to do that is to show them
Hmm.
through text the things that are mattering to me right now in this book. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have you continued to do that? Is that something?
So, because I had so much fun with this book, I mean, that's the thing, is what happened in the ninth hour and doing this to my text became like fun, like freeing, really
Uh-huh.
freeing. I felt light with the text and playful. I now am doing it in my shorter pieces, my standalone essays, my flash and longer essays, and in my second book that's coming out next year. I'm working really hard to make it different.
Mm-hmm. So, because yoga is also important to you, how did that sort of connect or manifest in the book? And what role does that play in the book?
Someone said to me not long ago, it's almost like a character in the book, and I was like,
Huh.
yeah, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yoga is a character in the book, a very important secondary character. Yoga is my becomes my outlet. I mean, yoga for me 30 years ago, 28 years ago, when I first got on the mat, was just my place to have my own space, separate from home, separate from the religion that was such a hot button and is a hot button, separate from my spouse, separate from my brother who also represents that religious hot button. And it kind of served as this vacuum. It just sucked my negative energy out
Hmm.
to the point where, husband would come home and I would just hand off the kids, very typical, and he would just say, like, go to class. Yeah.
So, as you were, I mean, that's sort of one of the things that interests a lot of writers, and certainly interests me, is how writers write. I mean, like literally. So, given that you were moving, given that you have a lot of different interests, given that you have a family, how were you able to sort of focus on this and write the memoir in the time that you did?
Well, so the story stops in 2011. So there's some distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and distance and healing and reconciliation maybe or like the move to Israel in 2011, it was not easy and it didn't go so smoothly so that's what the second book is, those 7 years of
Mm-hmm.
a lot of ups and downs. But overall, there's something that happened for us where all of the angst much of the angst in the relationship between us was eased with that move.
Mm-hmm.
Like what? So when we were in the States, we were in New York and we were paying tuition for our kids to go to Jewish private schools. I mean, it's like this around your neck to have
Mm-hmm.
to raise your kids like that. And so when we got to Israel and our kids were in the public school system and we no longer had that crazy, crazy amount of money that we had to pay for education, it allowed us to do things we had never been able to do before, to start really traveling with our kids. So
Mm-hmm.
they're trade-offs. The book is also to show, I think, that life is all about trade-offs from where you live to how you live, the choices that you make. We make one choice that might not be ideal, but it's a trade-off with another. We were looking, there is no utopia to live. There's no place ideal, but good things happened with the move up until last Saturday.
Mm-hmm. When you talked about home, and do you feel like the memoir helped you come to a place where you could say, I think I know what it is now? Did writing the memoir help you get to that place?
Writing the memoir helped me see something that was critical, which was I spent 20 something years pointing a finger at my spouse saying, I live there because of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood that I had had my own fascination with Israel. I'd had my own questioning if I belonged before meeting him. Writing that memoir helped me, reinforced for me his apology in therapy for having me ask me to do Judaism his way.
Mm-hmm.
But it also made me understand if I could accept his apology, I I had to accept, I had to also apologize to myself and ex accept that I too, he asked me to do something I didn't want to do, and I said yes.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did that, I let go of myself, and I needed to apologize to my younger self.
Mm-hmm.
And that was huge. That for me was emotional when I was writing this. That
And that.
that adult understanding, that growing up and understanding that it wasn't all his fault. I was
Mm-hmm.
also to blame.
Mm-hmm. And so it was writing through the memoir that helped you realize some of that, at least.
Yeah.
And how, go ahead.
And I would say the third thing that happened in the writing of the memoir is that I understood that Judaism was to him as yoga had become to me, and
Hmm.
vice versa.
A place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was his.
Yeah.
That, and I don't know if this is part of it, but it sounds like a place that was his, that he was inviting you to.
Oh,
If
I
you,
tried inviting him to yoga many years.
yeah. Well, some boundaries we cross, some we don't.
Well, if I say left to him, he goes right. So
Okay.
it's just
Yeah.
there's some issues.
Yeah. So you said that home, one of the things you were learning and learned that was that home wasn't necessarily a place. Can you say more about what you came to that home is, at least for you?
Yeah. So I think most people get it. I think most people, from either Hallmark cards or ABC after school specials, like I think most people just understand that home is inside. But because I had been for over 2 decades, I had been feigning a way of life for the sake of peace in the house, doing Judaism the way my husband had asked me to do it. I was not at home inside.
Mm-hmm.
I was uncomfortable inside. I was putting my kids into schools in America that made me shudder. So I did not feel at home in my
Mm-hmm.
skin. So it's that.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question because, sorry about the cat, because there are people for whom home really is a place. I mean, I have a friend who's also a writer who, for her, she just moved back to where she feels like home is. And for her, that geographical move, which is like 2,000 miles,
Hmm.
that's where she can feel at home. So, on the one hand, she takes it. But on the other hand, for her getting back to the land, that's home. And I think there are people who feel that way. I mean, I
Hmm.
feel that way to some degree about the ocean. And so I'm wondering if, given that you move from place to place, is there some of each? Or because you moved from place to place, do you think it's more internal for you than it might be for some people?
I think because I moved from place to place, I learned about myself that I am incredibly adaptable. I love I'm open. We do change well. We move well.
Mm-hmm.
We had issues that we didn't do well. We moved well. We started over well. We created community well. We found friends. We were like chameleons every time we moved.
Mm-hmm.
And each time I think I I found like my happy place. But then I knew up until that move back to Israel in 2011, I just knew inside we weren't staying. I knew
Uh-huh.
every time we'd move, it felt like there was an understanding that it wasn't going to be long.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a question of when.
Mm-hmm.
So, so here I am back in the States for 5 weeks, first in California for 3, where I'm from, and now in New York for almost 2, where we lived for 10 years. And again, I'm like super comfortable. I know my way around. I have friends to call on. I have friends I can knock on the door and say, oh my God, I'm hungry. Can I come in for a meal? Like I'm just really comfortable with all of that. And the last, 9 days have been, and friends that I've turned to cry with.
Yeah.
And could I move back tomorrow? I don't know, because I've changed.
Hmm.
America's changed. I've changed.
Yeah.
There's a lot I love, but there's so much I don't connect to anymore.
Hmm.
So it's tricky stuff.
Yeah.
It's hard to navigate.
Well, and it goes back to what we talked about, that if you're aware of an historical context, then you have to be aware of change. You have to be aware that the New York of, say,
Wow.
September 10th, 2001,
Right.
is not the New York of September 12th, 2001, and it changed.
Yeah.
And I guess you could speak to that too, about what happened last week. I mean, do you feel like you're going back to a place that is the place that you were writing about, or that you'd have to sort of not rewrite the memoir, obviously, but that as you write again, you're writing about something that's changed?
Yeah. So I think being here and having the events unfold these past 8 days, 9 days, I mean, I feel tremendously distant. Um, with that comes a helplessness, but I
Yeah.
think everybody feels helpless right now. I feel an inability to process what has happened, like a
Mm-hmm.
real, like almost an immaturity in my head. Like I cannot fathom what has gone down.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond. It's all of my fears I ever brought into a therapy room and beyond. And so I talked to my son yesterday and asked him how the weekend, how Shabbat was, and he said, fine, we only had 2 to 3 sirens each day. And I mean, that's not
Mm-hmm.
normal where we live in the center of Israel in Tel Aviv. That is not normal. That is not how we normally live. And if that's our new normal, could I stay living there? I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's really hard to answer that question. It's like a whole new, I don't want to say reality, but a whole new landscape. And I don't know.
And as a writer, kind of going forward, is writing one of the ways that you think you will manage when you go back, in terms of, I mean, what you said, who can really wrap their head around this? I mean, people are comparing it to 9/11. I think it's quite different, but I do remember 9/11, and I don't live in New York now, but I was a New Yorker and just was born and raised in New York. And I don't remember being able to know how to think about it. I just didn't know how to think
Yeah.
about it. And sometimes writing is a way that we get through things, or make give us a way to relate to a world that we couldn't relate to. Do
Mhm.
you foresee writing being that for you?
For sure, for sure. And honestly, I might need some therapy. I mean, I think the other thing that happened for me in this book is the understanding. It happened in a yoga class. I had a moment, I want to say I was around 50 years old, so I'm 58. So in other words, after 2011,
Mm-hmm.
but basically an understanding when I was in a yoga class and I came out of a pose and I burst into tears that I had PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Siren that I heard the sirens that I heard and ran for shelter in
Yeah.
1991 as a 25-year-old, naive, protected, sheltered young American woman in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And that I never thought of that. I never thought that that's what, I don't think of my, I'm not a war veteran, none of that. But
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure that I could say pretty firmly, I have PTSD. And I think that if I go back November 1st. And if I get back there and it's that same situation and that siren is going on and on, I might just have to check into, some therapist's office.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't answer that question,
Mm-hmm.
but it triggers me. It's visceral. It's my whole body.
Mm-hmm. And when you put a memoir out, it's going to be read by so many different people.
I hope so. Please, please, please.
Partly why we're doing this. And some people are going to be able to connect to what you're saying in terms of a PTSD reaction. I mean, there will be hopefully people who hear this interview who have lived in Israel themselves, who can really connect to what you're saying. And then there will be people for whom this is another life. What do you hope the broad range of readers will take away from your book?
Such a good question. I think initially, again, I came to the States about 4 weeks ago, and I was all about this book is a book of voice for women to understand, not to give it up, not to give it up in a relationship, in the workplace. Use your voice. That was my emphasis. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a big part of the book. It really is. I think now it's still about voice, but in a really different way. The region where I live is wrought with tension and irreconcilable differences. And we need support, and we need not to be judged. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's so. I have things where I can say, I'm not political. I don't feel strongly. I cede. It's okay. I have something about which I feel so strongly. No one has the right to judge Israel unless they come, live there, put their kid in the army, live through some sirens, run for shelter under 90 seconds, or if you're in a car, get out of your car, get onto the sidewalk and crouch and put your arms behind your neck, and then you may have an opinion of what it's like.
So I hear two things in that, which doesn't mean there aren't more. But one, which we actually haven't touched on, is that you're writing this partly as a woman and the notion of female voice. We can come back to that. And also, it sounds like what you're saying is for people who might have no clue about what this is like, can you bring them a way to put themselves imaginatively in
Yeah.
this situation?
Yes, but again, when I came to the States September 18th for a 6-week book tour, that latter part was not on my agenda
Mm-hmm.
at all.
Hmm.
Now it is.
Mm-hmm. So the stronger was the notion of voice.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And this may be a huge question. I don't know, but what was the origin of that for you as you wrote the memoir? I mean, a memoir is voice in many, many ways. And how much of it, as you wrote, was very consciously, I'm a female, I want women to hear this possibility that they have a voice and shouldn't sacrifice that.
I don't actually think it was that. It was
Hmm.
that in my marriage, I felt like my voice was being shushed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not because I married some dictator. He's
Mm-hmm.
not a dictator. It's just that he has a stronger voice. He
Mm-hmm.
comes from a culture, he's French, and he comes from a culture a little bit like father knows best.
Uh-huh.
Papa says. If Papa says, then that's the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to make him sound, I know the word you want to use here is patriarchal and all of that. It's not that. It's just that his voice was louder than mine.
Uh-huh.
And so it took me to write this book. Honestly, for him, when he read it, it was like the first time knowing everything that I think I was going through 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
He was not privy to all of this because I felt like there wasn't room
Right.
for all of it. His
Mm-hmm.
voice was more dominant than mine.
Mm-hmm.
I was young and impressionable and in love, enamored, and I gave up my voice, but I didn't know I was doing it.
Right.
I needed
And
to
I think,
grow up to
yeah,
understand that.
I
Yeah,
mean, it's not an unusual experience.
I know.
And the other person doesn't have to be patriarchal for that to just, I mean, I'm a psychologist by trade. I mean, so much happens that happens out of awareness because of the ways that we've been raised and trained, and nobody's a bad guy. It just,
Well, so that's really interesting you say that. So I was talking with a very dear friend when my son was getting married, and I had completely fallen apart because my son My son is religious the way my husband is religious, and he was marrying someone religious. And I was just like, I can't get away from this religion. And my brother's super ultra Orthodox. And I just feel like my own religion smothers me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was telling this dear, dear old friend who's known me for so long some stories about childhood. And she goes, so it's as if you weren't being seen or heard. And I just got the chills. I was like, is
Mm.
that what it is? So then I entered a marriage where it just continued and I let it happen because I was so used to it already. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's that.
Yeah. Not that unusual, I have to
I
say.
know. I didn't feel unloved. I'm not
Yeah.
saying I wasn't
No.
loved. I'm
No.
just saying my brother had the louder voice. I had no choice but to be quiet.
I mean, in the pieces I've read, because I didn't get a copy of your book soon enough, but I read a number of other pieces that you've written. I will say there's no point where I thought, oh, her husband's a bad guy.
Right.
I mean, that did not come
Right.
through at all. It really felt like you had two people trying to figure out how to do this,
Yeah.
and then trying to figure out what this is even, and I think that's something that writing helps us all with, is that sometimes we just sort of put it down and go, oh my goodness, well, what do you know about that?
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of the practical, because we have about 15 minutes left, in terms of the practical, how did you have any trouble finding a publisher for this? Or how did you go about going from you're in an MFA program to publishing a book?
Not a straight road, not an easy road. You have to have very tough skin. You have to not take it personally. Lots of rejection. I mean, it's
Uh,
like the whole submission process with, stories, essays, memoir pieces that I'd been doing for years, over a decade,
mhm.
only amplified. So first of all, I knew that it was not agent worthy. It was too untraditional.
Huh.
I tried a few, but that I just walked away from that.
Mhm.
I knew it was small independent press material, and it does not surprise me that it ended up with a press that is with one American woman who lives in Munich, Germany, and one Australian woman who lives
Ah,
in Athens, Greece. So it does not shock me at all.
yeah.
It's exactly where it should be, in the hands of people who have a worldwide view.
Mhm.
Because the American take on it, it was not good. I did not always get nice feedback. I started in my queries. I actually got bold enough to say at the end of my query letter, the region where I live is fragile. Please treat my words with care,
Mhm.
to protect myself.
So just because the nitty gritty can sometimes be really helpful, can you say more about, one, what kind of responses you did get, and also how did you find your way to the press that was the right one?
Google, to the latter, Google, let your fingers do the walking and read. So it was in the reading of the what do we call it? Not competitive. The books that are like your book, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. So I had a proposal, the whole thing. So I read two other books by this press, Vine Leaves Press,
Uh-huh.
that were collection of vignettes. That was a category that they have, collection of vignettes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I think that's what I've got. So for me, it came there. I knew the press because I read two books that were similar-ish to mine. Um, one of the emails I got from an editor was, I want to be transparent and we don't believe in ethnic cleansing.
Really?
No, no words. I'm not gonna continue on that. Just when
Huh.
I got the rejection a few months later, I was like, I didn't even need that rejection. It was kind of, obvious. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Leave it at wow.
exactly.
I mean, part of the reason I ask about the nitty gritty is it's so hard when, I mean, writing can be so solitary. It is so solitary. And you send things out and you get rejections and you're sort of sitting there looking at your computer in the old days, some kind of letter, and it can go right to your heart. And you're kind of alone with it, at least for a few minutes, if not much longer. And so I just was curious, what did you have to sort of live through to get to where you were going?
So I think detachment, which I've learned in yoga. non-attachment. It's a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Buddhist tenet. It's
Yeah.
just, you have to.
Yeah.
You just have to.
Yep. It's hard though.
And it needs to learn how to live with, I believe in this, and I'm going to keep marching forward.
Mm-hmm.
Persistence, perseverance, call it
Yep.
what you want. It's both of those things.
Mm-hmm. And so, question a little out of order, and then I'm going to come back to just a general question. But what was it like, and were you concerned about writing about other people?
So yeah. So my son was in his early 20s when he asked me in 2016 to please stop using his name. And I mean, my kids were doomed because I'd been writing about them already since when my son was 2 and before my girls were born. I wrote about my pregnancies with my girls. I wrote for
Mm-hmm.
babycenter.com from 1997 to 2002 in San Francisco. We were living there. I wrote about children's health, my children's health, children's development, my children's development, women's health, my health, all of it. So when my son asked me to no longer use his name, I was like, okay, I respect that. And then I realized if I didn't use his, I wasn't going to use my daughter's.
Mm-hmm.
So that was easy. That was an easy fix. But then I also have a sibling who threatened to sue me if I wrote about him.
Hmm.
So I got a little creative. So he's Sib, and the pronoun is they.
Uh-huh.
And the shift in language in America works for me.
Right.
I could use they.
Right.
In my next book, I get even more creative, and you will see it in a year. And Philippe, well, he's also doomed because,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I wasn't going to call him Pierre. I've been writing
Yeah.
for way too long, and
Yeah.
it never even occurred to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's I always wonder that with memoir, like
Yeah,
you're writing about real people, and
yeah.
I suppose you can ask permission, but
I did. So my first yoga teacher, Rodney Yee, gave me permission and blurbed the book. My other yoga teacher, Susan, same thing. The 2 therapists that are mentioned, I went to both of them saying, I'm doing this. And I sent them the passages saying, do you want me to change your name? Both gave me permission to use their names. One of them is coming to an event of mine tomorrow night in New York.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I asked permission.
So you have another book coming out in a year. Do you want the opportunity to say a little about that book tonight so people will
I,
keep an eye out for it?
I do, but I don't have a good elevator pitch. It's the same thing I said earlier, which is Landed, a yogi's memoir in pieces and poses, is about my
Uh-huh.
7-year journey, my 7-year search on and off a yoga mat. And then I can't remember the rest of what I'm supposed to say.
I have no idea. So
I didn't come prepared on that one.
that's all right. That's all right. I just sort of I like open-ended questions that give people a chance to meander if possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I'm looking, there aren't questions in the chat at this point. Are there questions that I haven't asked you that you wish I had?
My target audience.
Go for it.
So it is not the Jewish world,
Mm-hmm.
ironically. It is the non-Jewish world. And it's for me the non-Jewish American world. And it's for
Mm-hmm.
me the non-Jewish American world that has its preconceived notions of Israel because of what it reads in the media, which
Mm-hmm.
might not be slanted in the way that I find favorable. Not in a way to say, and that is my target audience, and it has been for years in everything that I write, as a way for me to come and say, hey, please enter my world.
Mm-hmm.
As a reader, I love reading about Chinese culture with words in Chinese, with all of the history of the culture, the people, the traditions. Like, it's fascinating to enter that world. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my equivalent. I'm offering the same thing. And so therefore, when you see some of the footnotes, another technique I use, it's to
Huh.
say, hey, I don't assume that you, the reader, understand what I'm talking about. I don't want to put it in the story because I don't want to stop the flow of the story, but look down here and you can learn more.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So a target audience who you want, and kind of been a theme for all the talking we've done, to kind of show your world to
Yeah.
and have them have a real deep sense of it, as deep as
Yeah.
possible, a deep and personal sense, but personal again within this larger context.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems
Yeah.
so. We have just a couple more minutes. Is there anything else before we wrap up? Is there anything else either about the present or just about anything else that we've been talking about that you want to make sure you tell people?
So, I feel sad. I feel sad by the state of the world. I feel sad by the state of the region where I live. I feel sad that my book came out and 32 days later, this is what happened, and it can make my book sink and disappear.
Hmm.
And I'm I'm working really, really, really hard to make it swim and to perhaps it's a weird thing to say, but perhaps illuminate in a way what it's like to live there,
Mhm.
what it feels like to just try and be human and to live in this region. And I'm looking for support. I'm looking for people to buy it, to share it,
Mhm.
to post it on social media, to recommend it to people, to check want to read on Goodreads, to leave
Yeah.
a review on Amazon, on Goodreads, on Barnes and Noble, just to please help me because otherwise it will disappear. And I worked really hard.
It's interesting because I mean, my gut reaction is that it wouldn't disappear. But in fact, I mean, I'm I'm your audience. I mean, that's me. I'm an American non-Jewish person, and I would gravitate toward reading. I mean, I would have gravitated toward it anyway. But given what's happened and wanting to understand as much as possible, and kind of wanting to navigate around the media,
Mhm.
and know that the media has its own thing that it's doing. But to know what it feels like, even if it's not being written, like today, this is how I feel, this is how I felt 15, 20 years ago, still seems to me it's very
Relevant.
relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I think. That's what I'm hoping.
So I hope, I mean, this happened in between the time that we were going to do this interview and then had to reschedule because of Zoom. So
Right.
maybe Zoom was on our side, but I think I hope that is the ultimate result of this.
Yeah.
So
Thanks so much.
okay, so I'm gonna wrap us up. I'm gonna do my little spiel and for the writers room and say, I welcome anybody in the audience who's either hearing this in real time now or watching the recording. Um, there will be other interviews and those will be posted. There's a reading from the room coming up in late October, and then we're still organizing the interview series. So check out the website and check out Instagram and Facebook, and we will post things as soon as we know what we're doing. And we're looking forward to doing this again and hopefully bringing in new members and helping people see other ways of writing, other ways of thinking about writing, and giving authors a chance to speak. So
Thanks, Marjorie.
thank you. Okay. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night, everybody.